There are moments when desperation strips away pretense, when survival instinct overrides logic, when a single mistake becomes the only thing standing between death and salvation. There are also moments when fate operates through channels that are so improbable, so unlikely, so impossible that they seem designed by something beyond human understanding. When a wrong number becomes a lifeline, when a random error becomes a thread connecting two people across a distance that neither of them could have imagined they were separated by. This is the story of a woman who made one wrong decision, a decision that would change the entire trajectory of her life, and how that single moment of accidental contact with a man she'd never met transformed everything she thought she knew about fate, about danger, about the possibility of rescue arriving from the most unexpected direction. Her name is Maya Richardson, and for 31 years her life was almost perfect. She was born in Atlanta, Georgia, to a family of teachers. Her mother taught history at a comprehensive school, her father taught mathematics, and both of them instilled in their 3 children a love of learning, a respect for knowledge, a belief that education could be a path to a life that transcended economic limitation. Maya became a journalist. She graduated from Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism with honors. She worked for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution for 6 years, covering local government corruption, investigating organized crime connections to the city's construction industry, building a reputation as someone who wasn't afraid to ask difficult questions, someone who couldn't be intimidated by powerful people with things to hide. Which is exactly how she met Thomas. Thomas Brennan is 42 years old, and he's the kind of man that mothers warn their daughters about. Not because he's obviously dangerous, not because he walks around radiating threat or exhibiting the outward signs that society has taught us to recognize as dangerous, but because he's dangerously charming. He's 6'2", with blue eyes that seem to understand exactly what you want to hear, with a smile that makes people trust him instinctively, with a presence that makes people want to confess things they've never told anyone. He's also a sociopath, though he's never been formally diagnosed, and if he had been diagnosed he would have paid whatever price necessary to bury that diagnosis, to ensure that his psychological profile never became public record, to maintain the carefully constructed facade of normality that he has perfected over decades. Thomas works as a private investigator, which is a term that covers a multitude of professional activities. Some of those activities are legal. Some are not. Some exist in a gray space where it's difficult to determine whether they violate laws or just violate ethics. Thomas's specialty is information gathering, finding things out about people, acquiring documents that people would prefer to remain private, creating situations where people feel compelled to reveal secrets. He's been hired by corporations to investigate competitors. He's been hired by wealthy men to gather information on potential ex-wives. He's been hired by criminals to find out which members of their organizations are cooperating with federal prosecutors. He's been hired by intelligence agencies to do things that he never speaks about, things that operate in spaces where legality is irrelevant because the organizations involved exist outside normal law. Thomas met Maya at a bar in Atlanta, at a journalists' event where people from the news world gathered to drink expensive whiskey and discuss stories. He was not a journalist. He was there because he'd been hired to investigate the editor of a major television news operation, someone who had become a problem for a client who preferred to remain unnamed. Thomas saw Maya at the bar, and he understood immediately that she was intelligent, that she had access to information networks, that she would be valuable to know, that she could be useful to him in ways that she couldn't possibly anticipate. He charmed her. He did this expertly, the way he had charmed dozens of women before her, with the precision of someone who understood human psychology deeply, who knew exactly which buttons to push, which desires to activate, which vulnerabilities to exploit. He told her about his work as an investigator, presenting it in a way that suggested it was all perfectly legal, suggesting that he was simply someone who helped people understand the truth about other people. He listened to her stories about journalism, about the corruption she was investigating, about the compromises she had to make as a professional in an industry that demanded certain compromises. He made her feel understood the way that skilled manipulators make people feel understood, by reflecting their own desires back at them, by suggesting that he alone could appreciate their struggles, by creating an intimacy that felt special, that felt like something that transcended normal human connection. Over 6 months, they became involved in what could charitably be called a relationship. Thomas spent time at Maya's apartment. He met her friends. He appeared to be integrating himself into her life. But what Maya didn't understand was that this entire relationship was orchestrated. Thomas didn't care about her. He didn't care about anything except extracting information and then determining whether that information could be used for his benefit. What he learned from Maya was invaluable. He learned which local government officials were corrupt, which ones were vulnerable to manipulation, which ones had secrets that could be leveraged. He learned which corporations were engaged in illegal activity, which law enforcement officers had been compromised, which federal prosecutors were building cases against organized crime organizations. He learned the names of her sources. He learned about her investigation techniques. He learned about vulnerabilities in her reporting process that he could exploit. And when he had extracted all the useful information he could obtain from Maya, when he had determined that she no longer had value to him, Thomas disappeared from her life as suddenly as he had appeared in it. Maya didn't understand what had happened. She called him. He didn't answer. She sent him messages. He didn't respond. She went to his office, only to discover that he had vacated the space and left no forwarding address. It took her several weeks to understand the truth, that the relationship had been a lie, that she had been manipulated, that she had shared information with someone she shouldn't have trusted, that she had been used. But that wasn't the end of the story. That was just the beginning. 3 weeks after Thomas disappeared from Maya's life, she was followed. She first noticed it on a Tuesday evening, leaving the Atlanta Journal-Constitution office. The same car, a black sedan, following her through downtown Atlanta. She changed direction, drove through several neighborhoods, and the car continued to follow. She drove to the police station. The car disappeared. But the next day it returned. And the day after that it was there again. Maya went to the police. She reported that she was being followed. She provided descriptions of the vehicles, descriptions of the men she could sometimes see inside those vehicles. The police took her statement. They said they would investigate. Nothing happened. 3 weeks passed. The surveillance continued. Maya began sleeping with a knife under her pillow. She began driving in patterns designed to notice followers. She became paranoid in the way that people become paranoid when they understand that something real is happening, that they're not imagining things, that there is an actual threat to their safety. She understood that the paranoia was justified, that her fear was based on reality, that the world had become genuinely dangerous. And then on a Thursday evening while she was walking home from the grocery store, a walk she'd made 1,000 times before, a route through her neighborhood that she knew intimately, a path that she believed was safe, Thomas appeared. He stepped out from behind a parked car, blocking her path on the sidewalk. He was smiling that same charming smile, but the light in his eyes was different now. The light of someone who had removed his mask, who was no longer pretending, who was operating without the constraints of deception because he had determined that deception was no longer necessary. And there were 2 men with him, men with the kind of body language that suggested they did violence for a living, men who moved with the confidence of people who understood that they were more powerful than the person they were approaching. "Hello, Maya," Thomas said, and his voice was conversational, as though they were bumping into each other at a coffee shop rather than on a dark street at 8 in the evening. "I need to talk to you about the information you've been sharing." "What information?" Maya asked, and her voice was steady, though every muscle in her body was screaming at her to run, though every instinct was telling her to abandon her grocery bags and sprint toward the nearest public space. "The information about the people I've been investigating," Thomas said. "You've been talking to federal prosecutors, haven't you? You've been feeding them information about my clients, about my operations. You've been very helpful in that regard, actually. You helped them build their case. And now they're moving forward with an investigation that my clients find inconvenient." "I don't know what you're talking about," Maya said, and she was lying, and she knew that he knew she was lying, and the understanding that pretense was pointless created a strange kind of clarity. "I think you do," Thomas replied, and his smile didn't change, but something in his face became harder, colder. "And I think you're going to help me fix this problem. You're going to contact the federal prosecutors you've been speaking with, and you're going to tell them that you were mistaken, that all the information you provided was inaccurate, that you fabricated everything because of professional jealousy or personal issues. You're going to recant." "I won't," Maya said, and the refusal cost her something, cost her the possibility of an easy resolution, cost her the chance to resolve this situation without violence. Thomas's smile didn't change, but something in his face became harder, colder, more dangerous. "Yes, you will," he said. Because if you don't, I'm going to destroy you. I'm going to release information about your family. Information about your father's financial difficulties, about your mother's alcohol problem, information about your siblings that would devastate them. I'm going to make sure that you can never work in journalism again. I'm going to make sure that everyone you know understands exactly what kind of person you are. And I'm going to make sure that you understand what it means to be completely powerless. Maya backed away. Thomas stepped forward, maintaining the distance between them. One of the men with him moved to block the street, cutting off her retreat in that direction. The other man moved to block the other direction. She was trapped on a street that had been empty moments before and remained empty now, as though the city had conspired to create this moment, to isolate her from help, to place her in a situation where resistance seemed futile. And then she ran. She didn't think about it, didn't plan it, just turned and ran toward the nearest building, which happened to be an apartment complex. She pushed through the door into the hallway, up the stairs. Behind her, she could hear Thomas and his men following. She ran until she reached the roof. She looked for another exit, found a fire escape, climbed down onto an adjacent building, dropped from the fire escape to the alley below. She landed wrong. Her left arm, twisted beneath her as she hit the pavement. She felt the bone break, felt the white-hot flash of pain that comes from a fracture. But she didn't stop moving. She was running on adrenaline, on the pure instinct to survive, on the absolute certainty that if Thomas caught her, she would die. She made it to her car. She made it to the nearest hospital. She checked herself into the emergency room at Emory Healthcare, claiming that she had fallen, that she had broken her arm in the fall. The doctors set the fracture, placed her arm in a cast, admitted her for observation because the fall had also caused a concussion, and she needed to be monitored for potential internal bleeding. It was in the hospital room at 3 a.m. that Maya finally allowed herself to cry. She was safe, or relatively safe. Thomas couldn't do anything to her in a hospital surrounded by security and witnesses. But she was also trapped. She couldn't leave. She couldn't run. And she knew with absolute certainty that Thomas would come for her. He would find her. He would finish what he had started. He would extract the price for her refusal to cooperate, for her insistence on maintaining her integrity, for her determination to tell the truth regardless of the consequences. She lay in the hospital bed, her left arm in a cast, her body aching from the fall and the chase, and she tried to figure out what to do. She could call the police again, but they had already proven useless. She could call the federal prosecutors, but they would want to protect her through some kind of witness protection program, and that would mean losing her life as she knew it, leaving Atlanta, leaving her career, leaving everything. She could try to leave the hospital and run, but she was injured, she was monitored, she was in no condition to be on her own. Or she could do something desperate. Something that would require placing her trust in someone she didn't know, someone she had no reason to believe would help her, someone who had no obligation to her and no reason to become involved in her situation. She lay in the hospital bed and she took her phone. A phone that the hospital had let her keep, a phone that she had used to contact her family and tell them she was all right, and she opened her text messages. She had been saving a number for months. A number that had appeared in her research about Atlanta organized crime. It was the number of a man named Viktor Petrov. Viktor is 40 years old, and he is the head of the Russian organized crime operation that controls the southeastern United States. He's 39 years old. He was born in Moscow and came to America in 1995 with nothing but a reputation for ruthlessness and a network of contacts from his time in the Russian military and various criminal organizations. Over the course of 25 years, he has built an empire that is estimated to be worth more than $15 billion. He operates through legitimate businesses, restaurants, nightclubs, real estate development companies, and through entirely illegal enterprises that exist in the shadows. What Maya knew about Viktor Petrov was that he was dangerous, that he was powerful, that he had people who worked for him who could eliminate threats. She also knew, from her journalistic research, that he had a very specific code of honor. He didn't hurt innocent people. He didn't target journalists. He didn't engage in random violence. He was ruthless in his business dealings, but he followed certain rules, certain principles that suggested that he understood the difference between warfare and terrorism. Maya had saved Viktor's number because she had been planning to reach out to him for an interview, to try to understand the organizational structure of his operation, to write a story that might win awards. She had never actually contacted him. But now, in the hospital at 3 in the morning with a broken arm and nowhere to go, she decided that the time had come. She typed out a message. "This is Maya Richardson, journalist. I'm being hunted by Thomas Brennan. He's going to kill me. I need help. I'm at Emory Healthcare in the ICU wing. Room 412. She paused. She looked at the message. And then, without thinking about what she was doing, driven by desperation and the absolute certainty that she had nothing to lose, she hit send. The message was sent to a number that she had saved months ago, and she had no idea if it was still active, no idea if it would reach anyone, no idea if sending that message was the smartest thing she could do or the stupidest thing she could do. She had just placed her trust in a complete stranger, a man with no obligation to her, a man who had every reason to ignore her message, a man who could decide to use her vulnerability against her instead of helping her. What she didn't know was that the number she had saved was Viktor Petrov's personal number, and that Viktor Petrov had received the message directly, had read the message while he was in a private meeting with his advisors, and had immediately stopped the meeting to process what he had just learned. Viktor Petrov is unusual among crime bosses in many ways. One of those ways is that he reads newspapers. He reads them carefully. He reads them to understand which journalists are investigating him, which journalists might become threats, which journalists might become assets. He had read several of Maya's pieces about corruption in Atlanta. He had been impressed by her research, by her willingness to ask difficult questions, by the way she conducted her investigations with precision and care. He had never reached out to her. There had been no reason to. But he had filed her away in his mind as someone intelligent, someone capable, someone who might be useful in the future. And now that someone was asking him for help, Viktor picked up a phone. Not the phone that had received the message, but a different phone, a burner phone that he used for operations that required discretion. He called a man named Dmitry Volkov, who is his chief of operations, who handles the logistics of moving people, resources, and information across the network of businesses and criminal enterprises that makes up Viktor's organization. "I need to know where someone is," Viktor said in Russian, his voice carrying no emotion, no indication of whether this was a simple request or something that carried significant weight. "A woman named Maya Richardson. She's at Emory Healthcare, room 412 in the ICU wing. Find her. Secure her. And bring her to the facility in Buckhead. We're going to have a conversation about why she contacted me and what that conversation entails." Within 30 minutes, Dmitry had confirmed Maya's location. Within 45 minutes, he had positioned operatives at the hospital. Nurses, doctors, security personnel who worked for Viktor, people who appeared to be part of the hospital staff but who were actually part of his organization. Within an hour, they had infiltrated the ICU wing and had confirmed that they could move Maya securely without alerting hospital staff or raising any alarms. But before they could execute the extraction, Thomas Brennan arrived at the hospital. Thomas had tracked Maya through her phone, not technically because he didn't have the resources for that, but through his network of contacts in the Atlanta Police Department, through a detective who had been paid to provide information about Maya's movements. He had been told that she had checked herself into Emory Healthcare at 11 p.m. He had been driving toward the hospital for the past 4 hours, planning how he would approach her room, how he would intimidate her into doing what he wanted, how he would make it clear that there was no escape from his reach. He arrived at the hospital at approximately 3:45 a.m. He parked his car in the garage. He made his way to the ICU wing. And he was approaching Maya's room when he encountered the first problem. The door to the ICU wing was secured and he didn't have access credentials. He tried to bluff his way through. He told the security guard at the door that he was family, that he was there to visit a relative. The security guard, a man named Marcus who actually worked for Viktor Petrov, recognized immediately that Thomas was lying. Marcus had been instructed to let no one into the ICU wing except for hospital staff and Viktor's operatives. The security guard understood authority, understood when someone was trying to assert power over a space, understood when someone was a threat. "I can't let you through," Marcus told him, and his voice contained no apology, no suggestion of flexibility. Thomas's hand moved toward his jacket, reaching for the gun he carried concealed. But before he could draw it, Marcus had already activated a silent alarm, had already signaled to the other operatives in the wing that there was a threat that needed to be contained. 4 operatives appeared, seemingly from nowhere, appearing as orderlies or maintenance workers or other hospital staff. They surrounded Thomas. One of them was carrying a tranquilizer gun, the kind that can disable a person without permanent injury. Thomas looked at the four men, assessed the situation, and made a calculation about whether he could escape. The calculation came back negative. "Gentlemen," Thomas said, raising his hands, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," said a voice from down the hallway, a voice with a Russian accent. The voice belonged to Dmitry Volkov, Viktor's chief of operations. A man who is 51 years old and who has spent the last 30 years perfecting the art of resolving problems through methods that are simultaneously elegant and devastating. "My employer would like to have a conversation with Miss Richardson," Dmitry continued, speaking in English with a slight Russian accent. "And you appear to be someone who has been causing Miss Richardson problems. My employer does not appreciate when people cause problems for people he finds interesting. So what's going to happen now is that you're going to come with my colleagues, and you're going to answer some questions about your activities, about your threats, about your connection to the people who have hired you." Thomas didn't resist. He was intelligent enough to understand that resistance was futile, and he was arrogant enough to believe that whatever was going to happen to him, he could survive it and eventually escape it. He was wrong on both counts. What happened to Thomas in the hours that followed was not physical torture, not in the traditional sense. It was something far more sophisticated. Viktor's interrogators understood that the best way to extract information from someone like Thomas, someone who was sociopathic, someone who was accustomed to manipulating people through charm and intelligence, was not through violence but through psychological pressure. They placed him in a small room. They asked him questions. They allowed him to lie, and then they presented him with evidence that demonstrated his lies. They showed him documentation of his activities, his crimes, his connections. They showed him that they understood not just his current operations, but the entire architecture of his criminal enterprise. They showed him photographs of people he had worked with, people he had hurt, people he had destroyed. And they showed him with absolute clarity that he was now in the hands of people who were far more powerful than he was, far more intelligent than he was, far more willing to do whatever was necessary to accomplish their goals. By the time they were finished with him, Thomas understood one thing clearly. He was going to disappear. He was going to be transported to a location where Viktor could use him in whatever way Viktor determined would be most useful. And if he became useless, if he ceased to be valuable, he would be killed. While Thomas was being processed, while the interrogation was happening, while Viktor's operatives were determining exactly what information he possessed and how that information could be valuable to them, Maya was being moved from her hospital room. Two of Viktor's operatives, dressed as hospital staff, entered her room, explained that they were there on Viktor Petrov's behalf, and asked her if she would come with them. Maya's first instinct was to scream, to alert hospital security that she was being abducted. But one of the operatives, a woman named Tatiana, who is 34 years old and who works as Viktor's assistant, showed her a photograph on her phone. The photograph showed Thomas Brennan being transported out of the hospital by Viktor's men. The message was clear. Viktor was handling the threat. Viktor was removing Thomas from the situation. Viktor was, in his own way, rescuing her. "My employer would like to speak with you," Tatiana said, speaking in English with a Russian accent. "You have broken arm, you are injured, you cannot protect yourself. My employer can protect you. Come with us and you will be safe." Maya looked at Tatiana, looked at the other operative, looked at her hospital room that had become a prison, and she understood that she had two choices. She could try to escape, could try to find help elsewhere, and could likely end up dead. Or she could trust that the message she sent, the desperate reach for help from someone dangerous, had actually been received and actually been answered by someone who had decided to intervene. She chose to trust. They helped her out of bed, a process that was painful because of her broken arm and the soreness from the fall, and they guided her to a wheelchair, explaining to anyone they encountered that the patient was being transferred to another facility for specialized care. The cover story was so smooth, so professional that no hospital staff member questioned them. They wheeled her through the hallways of Emory Healthcare. They wheeled her into the elevator. And as they descended from the third floor toward the ground floor, as the elevator doors began to open on the lobby level, Maya saw a man standing in the lobby of the hospital, waiting for her. The man was Viktor Petrov himself. Viktor is shorter than Maya would have expected, maybe 5'10", with the kind of presence that makes physical size irrelevant. He has dark hair, dark eyes that assess everything they see, a face that is handsome in a severe way, a face that suggests intelligence and capability and absolute confidence in his own power. He was wearing a tailored charcoal suit and a shirt with no tie, and he moved toward Maya with the kind of grace that comes from someone who has spent his entire life understanding how his body occupies space, how power is communicated through posture and movement. "Miss Richardson," he said in English, his accent slight but noticeable, "I am Viktor Petrov. You sent me a message. You asked for help. I have provided that help. Now we are going to have a conversation about what comes next." He gestured to the operatives and they wheeled Maya toward the exit, toward a vehicle that was waiting outside, toward the beginning of something that neither of them expected. A relationship that would transform both of their lives in ways that they could not yet comprehend. In the car, as they drove through the pre-dawn darkness of Atlanta toward Viktor's headquarters, a building in Buckhead that served as both his office and his residence, Maya began to understand the magnitude of what she had done. She had reached out to a man who controlled vast criminal enterprises. She had asked for his help, and he had provided it. And now she was in his custody, in his car, in a situation where she was completely dependent on him for her safety. "Why did you help me?" she asked Viktor. Her voice was hoarse from disuse, from the trauma of the preceding hours, from the shock of being rescued by someone she didn't know. "Because you asked," Viktor replied simply. "And because I have read your work. You are intelligent. You ask good questions. People like that are rare. When they ask for help, I pay attention to why they are asking." "What happens to me now?" Maya asked. "That depends on you," Viktor said. "You can stay under my protection. You can continue your work as a journalist, but you will do so knowing that you are protected, knowing that people who might threaten you will understand that threatening you means threatening me. Or you can attempt to return to your previous life, knowing that the threats will return, knowing that Thomas Brennan will find you again if I do not prevent him from doing so." Maya understood, with a clarity that came from desperation and exhaustion and the understanding that her previous life was already gone, that she had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He was now connected to Viktor Petrov. He was now part of his world. And there was no going back. "I'll stay," she said. In the days that followed, Maya began to understand the nature of the bargain she had made. Viktor provided her with protection. He provided her with resources. He allowed her to continue her work as a journalist, but he expected her to be discreet, to not investigate his organization, to understand the boundaries of what she could investigate and what she could not. He set up a security detail for her. He ensured that she had the best medical care. He arranged for her to work from his office building in Buckhead, where she would be safe, where she could continue her journalism without fear. But something unexpected happened in the weeks that followed. Maya and Viktor began to spend time together. Not romantically at first, but as two people who were curious about each other, who found themselves drawn to conversation, who discovered that they had more in common than they would have expected. Viktor was interested in understanding how journalism worked, how information was gathered, how stories were constructed. Maya was interested in understanding how criminal organizations operated, how Viktor had built his empire, what his motivations were, what he valued beyond money and power. And as they talked, as they spent time together, as Maya's arm healed and she began to feel less like a prisoner and more like someone who had chosen this life, something shifted between them. It wasn't a sudden thing. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a slow realization that they were developing feelings for each other, that they were beginning to care about each other in ways that transcended the circumstances of their meeting. Thomas Brennan, meanwhile, had been transported to one of Viktor's facilities outside Atlanta, a warehouse that had been converted into a place where people could be kept secure. He was being interrogated continuously, being forced to provide information about his operations, his clients, his connections. And Viktor, understanding the value of what Thomas knew, was planning to use that information to expand his influence, to move against some of his competitors, to consolidate power in ways that Thomas's unwilling cooperation would facilitate. But more importantly, Thomas's disappearance sent a message throughout Atlanta's criminal underworld. If you threaten someone that Viktor Petrov is protecting, if you hurt someone that Viktor Petrov has decided to care for, you will disappear. You will vanish. And no amount of money or power or influence will bring you back. 6 months after the night of the wrong number text message, as spring turned to summer in Atlanta, Maya and Viktor formalized what had been developing between them. They didn't get married. Marriage would have been complicated, would have drawn unwanted attention from federal law enforcement. But they committed to each other in the way that people in their world commit, with an understanding that they were building a life together, that they were creating something that transcended the criminal enterprise that had brought them together. And Maya returned to journalism, but as a different kind of journalist. She began to write stories about organized crime, about corruption, about the intersection between criminal enterprises and legitimate government, but she did so with inside information, with understanding that came from being close to someone who operated at the highest levels of that criminal enterprise. Her stories began to win awards. She began to be recognized not just as a good journalist, but as a journalist who had unique insight into the world she was covering. What no one knew was that the insight came from pillow talk, from conversations late at night with a man who controlled billions of dollars of criminal enterprise, who was willing to trust her with secrets because he loved her, because he understood that her commitment to truth and to telling stories was something that transcended her connection to him. And Thomas Brennan? Thomas learned the true meaning of power. He learned what it meant to be held by someone who could hold anyone, who had resources that were completely beyond his comprehension, who could keep him alive for years if it served his purposes, or could end his life in an instant if it became convenient to do so. In the end, after 6 months of interrogation, after being completely exhausted of all useful information, Viktor made a decision to let him go. Not to free him. Thomas could never be freed, could never be allowed to return to his previous life. Instead, Viktor arranged for Thomas to be transported to a location where he would spend the rest of his life in a kind of exile, working for Viktor's organization in a capacity where he could do no harm, where he could cause no trouble, where his only function would be to serve the interests of people he had once considered beneath him. But before we finish this story, before we move on to the final thoughts, I want to address something important, and that's the nature of the choice Maya made. Because in our culture we often stigmatize women who become involved with dangerous men. We judge them for making choices that seem irrational. We assume that they are victims who have been manipulated or controlled. But what we often miss is that sometimes, when all your legitimate options have been exhausted, when traditional systems of protection have failed you, when law enforcement has proven useless, sometimes the most rational choice is to reach out to someone who has power outside of those legitimate systems. Maya's choice was not a good choice in an absolute sense. It was a survival choice, a choice made in desperation, a choice made by someone who had been failed by every system that was supposed to protect her. And what she discovered was that the person she reached out to, someone she had every reason to believe was dangerous, someone she had every reason to believe would exploit her, turned out to be someone who was capable of genuine human connection, someone who was capable of caring about another person, someone who was capable of building something real with someone he loved. So I want to ask you a question. What would you have done in Maya's position? When every legitimate option had been exhausted, when you were trapped in a hospital with a broken arm and nowhere to go, would you have reached out to someone dangerous? Or would you have tried to find another way? And more importantly, if reaching out to that dangerous person actually saved your life, would you regret the choice? Drop into the comments and tell me your answer. Tell me where you're from. Are you from Atlanta? Are you from somewhere that has a powerful criminal underworld? Tell me your country, tell me your city, because this community spans the entire globe and I want to know who you are, what brings you to these stories of people making impossible choices, of individuals navigating systems that have failed them, of connections forming in the most unexpected places. And if this story moved you, if you felt the desperation of Maya's situation, if you understood the calculus of survival she had to make, if you were moved by the unlikely romance that emerged from that desperation, please hit that like button. We're targeting 10,500 likes on this video because this story deserves recognition. This is a story about a woman who made one wrong decision that turned out to be exactly the right decision, about a man who was capable of genuine love despite his dangerous world, about the way that connection can transcend the circumstances that created it. Subscribe right now because there are 15 more stories about Viktor and Maya, about how their relationship develops, about how Maya's journalism becomes increasingly intertwined with Viktor's criminal enterprise, about what happens when federal law enforcement discovers their relationship and attempts to use it to investigate and prosecute Viktor's organization. We're going to explore the prosecutor's dilemma, where a federal agent must decide whether to turn Maya into an informant or to allow her to continue her life with Viktor, knowing that she might be complicit in crimes that she cannot acknowledge. We're going to investigate the betrayal, where someone within Viktor's organization discovers that Maya has been secretly documenting conversations with Viktor, that she's been gathering material for a book that might expose the inner workings of his criminal enterprise. And we're going to tell the story of the choice, where Maya must finally decide whether her commitment is to the truth that journalists are supposed to serve, or whether her commitment is to the man she has come to love, and whether those two things can ever be reconciled. I'll see you in the next video. Don't be late, because the story of Maya and Viktor is just beginning, and the complications that come from their connection are about to make everything infinitely more complex and infinitely more dangerous. The wrong number has sent ripples through their lives that neither of them could have predicted. And now we get to watch what happens when those ripples become waves, when a chance connection becomes a defining relationship, when survival becomes love, becomes something that transcends the boundaries between worlds, between systems, between the legitimate and the criminal, between the protected and the unprotected.